Hey, today I want to cover 4 tips to help you make better interviews every single time, save you time on those interviews and make them better quality. Let's get into it. Hey, I'm Colin Gray from the podcast host and Alitu, and today we're looking at interviews. Interviews are difficult. They're so often thought of as the easy option in podcasting because, well, you just turn up and you just talk to somebody and you make their expertise the focus of the show, don't you? But it's not really true. Interviews can so often be boring, the same as anything else, too long, because when you're interviewing somebody, you're giving over control of your show. They're then the focus of the show, and they then become almost the controller of it because they're the ones that are giving the answers. They're the ones that kind of control the content in many ways. Now you, as the interviewer, can take that control back, and you should, because it's your content. You need to take control over your show. It's your listener, your focus, your topic. You know what your listener wants. You know what you want your show to become. And so you need to take much more control over those interviews, and it can help you make a better show and save a lot of time in creating that show. So let's look at 4 different ways where you can take more control and create better interviews in the long run. Okay, number 1, tell them to keep their answers short. Okay? It's okay to tell your interviewees that you like short answers, that you like something conversational. The kind of thing that I would tell the interviewee is something along the lines of, right, so we like to keep this podcast really conversational. So what I'd like you to do is try and keep in mind, keep your answers relatively short, maybe just 30 to 60 seconds. When I ask you something, try not to talk for too long. Just give me a brief answer, and then because I know the listener, I know how to help you look the best in front of our listeners, I'll dig into the parts of that I know that they'll love. So give me a nice brief answer at first, and then we'll dig into the parts. I'll direct you and we'll have a good conversation back and forth. So try and keep them under 60 seconds, and that'll keep everything moving, conversational, and really dynamic. Okay, so a big part of this is making sure that you're explaining it to the interviewee in a way that says your hope is to make them look good. Okay, you're not controlling them. You're not criticizing their content, criticizing the way that they speak. It's the fact that you know your listeners, you know what your listeners want, and your goal is to make that interviewee sound great. All right, so the reason you're going to keep their answers short is because you want them to sound good. Number 2, ask them for their stories ahead of time. Now, often I get the question, should you send questions ahead of time to interviewees? I've covered that elsewhere. You can look that up on the blog. I'll keep a link in the description for you on that. But the other part of that is, should you actually try and draw out some stories from them ahead of time? I think the answer to that is a resounding yes. I think you need at least one good story. I think it's always worth getting in touch with the interviewee ahead of time and saying, right, what's your best story? What's your best, teaching? What's your best lesson? Try and tie that into a story. And this could be a 5 or 10 minute segment. And the trouble with these is that often the interviewee knows these, and they have like 3 to 5 or even up to 10 minutes that they often teach, that often goes over well. They know that people like it. They know that that's kind of one of their unique, viewpoints. It's one of the things that they know best, and that goes down really well with listeners. But often they'll talk about that ahead of time, and then you'll ask them one thing about it, and then they'll just go off on one. And that'll be a 3, 5, or even 10-minute monologue almost. What you want to do is ask for the story ahead of time, and then ask for a few questions to help you go through it so that you can make it conversational. So you say, what's your best story? What's your best lesson? Tee that up ahead of time, get that information from them, and then ask them for 3 to 5 questions that can guide them through it. So that means that then you can guide them through that story, that lesson, whatever it is, by asking those questions, and it breaks it right up. It keeps it much more conversational, means that the interviewee doesn't go off on a tangent. And doing that as well helps the interviewee to keep their answers brief again, because they know that they've got questions. They know they don't have to say it all. This is the trouble. They feel pressure to get the whole thing out all at once. And that's why they end up talking for ages. But if they know that you have questions, you've talked about it ahead of time, they know that you've got the prompts there, they feel more comfortable giving a bit of brief of an answer and then having a conversation around it instead. So it helps to make for a really good segment within the show that can really give your listeners that wow moment. And even better, helps you to not have to do so much research, of course. This gets you a load of good content where they are providing the questions, the guidance, and that makes for great content too. Okay, number 3 is prepare them to be interrupted and do it. Interrupt them, okay? Now, so often the trouble with interview shows is, again, I've highlighted this. The interviewees go off on tangents, they take control, they don't quite give the right answers, they don't answer the question. Ahead of time, I always tell my interviewees something along the lines of, so during this show, we like to keep it conversational, like to keep it, I want to make you sound as good as possible. So what I'm going to do is I will interrupt you from time to time. All I'm going to do is, because I know what my listeners want to hear, I know the kind of things my listeners enjoy, so I'll interrupt you, I'll stop you at various points. Now, please don't take offense at this. This is just me trying to keep you looking great in front of our listeners. Make sure that you're giving the information that they want so that you look amazing. So please don't be offended if I jump in and redirect the conversation or make sure we're talking about exactly what our listeners want. Is that okay? And that's what I'll say. And that little bit of prep means that from then on, if you find that you're, nodding, so often in interviews, you're like listening to the answer for the interviewee, and so many people, and I've done this myself, and I know I've talked to others who do it as well, the interviewee will talk for 2 minutes, and they'll end up repeating themselves once or twice, or going off on a little tangent that's not quite so relevant, and you kind of drift off, and you almost lose the tangent, falling asleep. But when that happens, take that as a signal that your listener probably lost interest long before that. So you need to interrupt that interviewee, okay? So take control, interrupt them. If you think they're going off on one, to think that it's not a topic that's that interesting, if you want to jump to something else, if you want to keep it moving, keep it dynamic, jump in and interrupt them. And if you give them that prep ahead of time, they won't be offended and you'll feel much more comfortable doing it too. Final one, number 4, is prepare that bio much more strenuously than you normally would. Now, I think one way to save a lot of time in editing, in actually creating the show, because it cuts down the time it takes to record, is to create that bio. And again, it creates better quality content too. Now, why? Because if you create an introduction for your interviewee, which includes things like a bit of their background, includes their standard story that they always tend to tell on every podcast. When so many podcasters go on and they're starting an interviewee by saying, well, tell me about yourself. And then the interviewee goes off and tells the standard 3, 5, even 10-minute story again. And it's all the same stuff. And maybe some of it's not relevant to your audience, some of it is, but it tends to just be a bit of a ramble. You can condense that down to get to the good stuff, because the background is all right, it's a fine story, it gives a bit of kind of credibility to that person, but it's not really what your listeners want to hear. Your listeners want the value, the knowledge, the teaching, or the entertainment, whatever it is that your interviewee can offer. So we want to get straight to that. So your goal in the intro is to bypass that entirely. It's to tell enough of the story in 30 to 60 seconds that your interviewee feels comfortable that their credibility has been established. And the key part for me is to make the offer that they want to make as well. Everyone comes on your show with some kind of goal. They're selling a book, they're selling a course, they're trying to get new coaching clients, whatever it is. Ask that up front. Ask your interviewee, what can I help you with? Like, what's your goal on this podcast? And if they say they're selling your book, then you do the bio. You say this person is an expert in X, Y, and Z. They went to this university. They had this story. This traumatic thing happened to them, but they came out the other side and they wrote a book and they've just released that book. If you want to go and see that book, go over to amazon.com/blah, blah, blah. And if you find them on social, you'll find them here, twitter.com here. Right. Tell me, what was the biggest lesson you learned in that thing happening? Does that make sense? You give the bio, you establish credibility, you make the offer, you give them this contact details, and then you ask a big question. And the interviewee suddenly goes, oh, I'll relax because, the story's been told, my offer's been made, they've told their listeners about my product, they've given them contact details so that, I can be contacted by all these people, I can grow my following, and they relax. And suddenly they become much more good quality as a guest because they don't feel like they have to do the party line. They don't feel like they have to tell a story. They don't feel like they have to sell their product. You've done that for them in the first minute of the show. You've got it out of the way, you've done it quickly, so it's done. And your listeners are fine with that. And then you jump straight into the good content. That saves so much time when recording a show. And it saves time in editing a show as well, because it means that you cut out so much of the fluff. And the interviewee, again, becomes a much better guest because they'll jump straight into the deep stuff, the good stuff. And they'll also feel a sense of reciprocity as well. You've done a favor for them, so they'll do a favor for you by really bringing their A game and really bringing the best information they can. So that's what I mean by great bios. Create that great bio, put just a bit of extra time into finding that product, the contact details, a bit more of the story, get that out of the way and get straight to the good stuff in your interview. So that's better interview techniques. That's 4 tips on how to make your interviews better and save a lot of time in recording those interviews, in editing interviews, really cutting the time it takes to ship your show. I've been Colin Gray. Please do check out alitu.com if you want an even quicker way to put your show out there. Alitu is our podcast maker app. You can record in there, call recording, solo recording, does your audio cleanup. There's episode building, so you can put your episode together, puts in your transitions and your music, and we have hosting in there as well, so you can host your show all in one place. It's a podcast maker that really just makes it as easy as possible to make your podcast as quick as possible to get your show out there every single week. And please do check out thepodcasthost.com for any further details. All right, I'll see you on a future video. Thanks for watching.